I'll hit. Hi everyone. I thought we'd record it. Sometimes we don't record them and amazing stuff happens, I reckon. So maybe I've jinxed it. But today we're reading Crito, which is another one of Plato's dialogues. This one's much shorter. And I guess as we jump into it, I think it's after the apology, isn't it? So he's been sentenced to death, basically, and he's in his jail cell, and his mate Crito comes along and offers him to get out of jail. It's a nice short dialogue. I was really pleasantly surprised because I was quite busy. But it was a good one. There was some really interesting detail that I appreciated. Made me think a lot because the argument that we'll get into is not my favorite. But no, it was good. What was I going to say about it? I forgot. Um oh yeah, made me think the beginning. Sometimes I think you've mentioned a few times, Judith, that often the beginning of the dialogue sets the scene for some important theme. Well, my version, I've got the Jowett, which is a bit different from your one. But he starts with, "Why have you come at this hour, Crito? It must be quite early."
Mm.
I don't know what that
Yeah,
foreshadows.
that's in I think so. I've got the PDF that I uploaded, the Cooper, but yeah, that's what it starts with. And oh well, I mean, it's usually I usually look at what the starting Greek word is, and I haven't actually this time. But if it's why, which which I suspect it is, then yeah, that's going to be key, isn't it? Why would Socrates do what he's doing, or
Hmm.
uh, yeah, why would he approach things the way he's doing it? That's the whole point of the dialogue, in some sense. When Crito comes up with an alternative.
Yeah, but on the other hand, they could all start with why.
That's true too.
Like, why are you going to the marketplace? All
Yeah.
right. So did you have anything you want to say about it, or do you just want to jump straight in?
No, let's jump in.
Yep. Well, basically, he's in prison and he's about to be put to death, and they're discussing that a little bit at the start. And Socrates has had some sort of vision, right, in a dream. He says, "A likeness of a woman fair and comely, clothed in white raiment, who called to me and said, 'O Socrates, the third day hence to Phthia shalt thou go.'" So he seems to think that he's going to die on the third day, not like the day after tomorrow, like Crito seems to have thought originally. So there's a bit of scene setting. I wondered how that was relevant. Do you have any ideas about, or was that just getting into a bit of the history and the of
Oh well, I think the whole thing's relevant. I mean, I think so. The situation is that this Athenian ship goes off to Delos every year, and that is to do with, and I'm not sure that no, it doesn't explain it, but it's to do with the one of the foundation legends of Athens, which is to do with Theseus defeating the Minotaur on Crete. Now it's a little bit obscure why the boat then has to go to Delos, not Crete. I don't quite understand, other than Delos was a sacred island on its own. But it's to do with that deliverance of the Athenian youth,
huh?
essentially. The youths and the maidens who had to go off, I think it was every 4 years, to be consumed by the Minotaur. And Theseus, with the help of Ariadne, defeated the Minotaur. So this was a foundation deliverance of Athens kind of story that's in the background here, or actually in the foreground. And because it was so important, that's why, and so sacred, that's why no executions could take place until the ship was back. So that's it's something central to Athenian identity that sets the scene here. So I think it is relevant because, of course, that's what Socrates comes back to towards the end of the dialogue is his attitude or his loyalty or or what he owes to the city, which he loves so much and which has
Hmm.
given him so much. So yeah, I just think that background is kind of relevant.
Yeah, very relevant. I didn't know that. So obviously he goes on later to talk about how dependent we are on the traditions of Athens. Yeah, so that makes a lot of sense. Okay. So where do you want to start it? What happens next?
Well, I think I think it's pertinent what you raised, Courtney, that that Crito is kind of, as we see, he's in a panic, right? And here's Socrates talk just about his dream, whereas and the Crito, he's almost not even listening to Socrates, or he doesn't take the dream seriously. He says, "A strange dream, Socrates," but Crito doesn't want to talk about that. He wants to talk about, "Oh, you perverse man, do let me persuade you, Socrates, even now, and save your life." Now, it turns out that what's motivating Crito is, on one level, yeah, it's his friendship and because he loves Socrates, but on the other hand, he's concerned about what people are going to say if he fails in the public mind to save his friend. That's really what he's concerned about, isn't it? It's the opinion of, it's the common opinion. It's what he thinks people are going to think.
Yeah, totally. And yeah, you're exactly right. He says it'll bring disgrace upon him, right? People will think that I valued money more than the life of a friend. So obviously he's somebody with some wealth and he could have got Socrates out of trouble by spending some money. And you're right. Then the interesting part comes up about the opinion of the many, which is a fairly common theme, and I think one that's inherited by Epictetus in particular. Do you want me to read that little bit? I think it's kind of cool. Socrates says, "But why, my dear Crito, should we care about the opinion of the many? Good men, and they are the only persons who are worth considering, will think of these things truly as they happened." And Crito says, "But do you see, Socrates, that the opinion of the many must be regarded as is evident in your own case, because they can do the very greatest evil to anyone who has lost their good opinion?" But Socrates says, "I only wish, Crito, that they could, for then they could also do the greatest good, and that would be well. But the truth is that they can do neither good nor evil. They cannot make a man wise or make him foolish, and whatever they do is the result of chance."
Oh, okay, that's an interesting translation, because here in my paperback one, it says that they do things quite at random.
Yeah.
Which I thought was, and what's in the PDF? In the PDF, it says they inflict things haphazardly. So it seems to me that that Crito, in his panic and his demand that Socrates, we've got to do something. He's kind of representing that random kind of opinion making and action. One minute he's saying this, another minute he's saying, he's kind of all over the place, and that's exactly what Socrates is pointing to as being a very unreliable guide to how we should proceed.
All right. And so obviously Socrates is going to say something like, "Well, Crito, we've been having these discussions for a while now, and were we just having them for fun? Was it just for entertainment? Because we were maintaining together that it's the opinion of the many that wasn't important, but rather the opinion of the wise person that was important." And he kind of is asking him, has he changed his mind? Or does he still agree with Socrates' belief that, yeah, basically that the opinion of the many is basically worthless, right?
Yeah, and just before we get to that, Crito, in his kind of casting around for something he thinks is going to influence Socrates, he comes up with his argument about Socrates' sons. What's the I think you're betraying your own sons also. It is in your power to bring them up and educate them. Now you'll go off and leave them. And as far as you're concerned, they must take their life as they find it. Either one ought not to have sons, or one ought to share their hardships in training and educating them. And you seem to me to choose the easiest way. But you ought to choose what a good and brave man would choose, especially when you are forever telling us that you cared for virtue all your life. Now, and that's one argument, and we can talk about that in a moment, I guess. But then he goes straight back to what is really his Crito's motivation here, which is what everyone's going to think. I'm ashamed myself, for my own sake, and our friends. I'm afraid the whole business about you may be thought to have been done because we were cowards, that the case was brought to court when it need not have been, and the whole course of the case and this end of it, we like a piece of mockery, and blah, 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 blah. So having brought forward what he thinks is a pretty clinching argument about Socrates' children, he then reverts to this preoccupation with what people are going to think.
Yeah.
But what do we think about the argument about abandoning his children? Now, Lorraine, Courtney and I have been rabbiting on it. Can I bring you in here? What would you think about that from Crito?
Well, it's an interesting argument, isn't it? Because he talks about them being orphans and who will look after them when he's gone. But Socrates sort of dismisses that to say that they will be looked after, which I find an interesting answer to it. This idea that just his friends will look after them and all will be well. So he kind of doesn't take responsibility for that. And I don't think he actually really answers that question of whether he is responsible for parenting them. Yeah,
He comes to it later, but you're right there, he doesn't really address it.
no, that's right.
He's not a very inspiring dad. My version says, Crito says, no man should bring children into the world who is unwilling to persevere to the end in their nurture and education. And that does feel like a kind of common sentiment, you know?
Yeah.
Like, what would happen if I died and, you know, my poor children? And mine aren't even going to end up in an orphanage, but, you know, they'll be deprived of my whatever, my input.
The other thing is too, that and this might be part of Socrates' reasoning, although I can't remember if he explicitly mentions it or not, but if Socrates were to do what Crito suggests and flee and escape, then he's still abandoning his children, right? So
Yeah.
unless that, you know, so maybe Socrates' thinking is that, well, the same friends who would look after my kids if I fled to Thessaly, well, they're going to still look after my kids if I'm put to death. There could be that equivalence in the background there, I don't know.
Yeah, I think you're right. He raises those problems later on. He sort of says those sort of things, doesn't he? He says, if I did go to Thessaly, and I was unsure how to take this, it seemed like he was saying, why would my friends look after them if I was over there in Thessaly? You know, I guess that would be a problem. Like they'd be like, hey, why don't you go live with your dad? He's in Thessaly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I guess, well, yeah, so without having investigated the whole thing about what happened to the children of people who were either in exile or executed, so it's not something I know about, but I suspect there would be legal penalties as a matter of course, quite possibly on the kids if Socrates escaped and was therefore an outlaw. I would say that's very likely, to be honest, but yeah, not really sure.
And he also says, yeah, if you took the kids with you, or they did end up in Thessaly, then they'd be deprived of the Athenian education, and that's not something you'd want for your children. So that's always in the background here is he values the Athenian way and its upbringing and its laws, and it would be the children would be deprived if he could somehow get in the way of that by living.
So
I mean, I can
yes,
see where he's coming from. Sorry.
Crito,
Just,
you mean? Or
I can
Crito,
say,
Socrates.
Socrates, I can see where he's coming from, like he doesn't, yeah, like, because we immediately think, well, what a bad dad, right? But actually when you read along, you kind of think, well, actually he's willing to have himself be executed because he kind of calculates that it might be better for the children in the long run. So he turns out to be possibly be doing the right thing. What do you think about that?
I guess that's his calculus, yeah, his measurement, because we know how he values costs and benefits, and so yeah, I'd say that's part of it.
And the thing about Thessaly is he makes the case that it's a lawless place, right?
Mm.
So his point being that it made me think of, and I'm sure we'll get more into this as we go along, but it made me think about, because there's a part of us there's a part of me that's like, I don't really like this argument, but I'm trying not to what's the word? Think about it anachronistically. Maybe he's sort of saying, well, Athens is really the hub of civilization, look at what we've achieved. And to live outside its walls is to miss out on all the things that obviously and clearly have made us such a great place to be. Maybe it's hard for us to think like that now because the whole of the world is mostly civilized, and we'd think, well, I'll just go to Thailand or something. But
Well, yeah, I think we get into this later, the issue of sort of Socrates very strongly felt Athenian patriotism. It's it comes out very strongly. But first of all, here I think in this next section, when after Crito and Socrates have each given a long speech, then Socrates starts an interrogation to try and get Crito back to first principles and get him thinking straight again, because he's all in a panic. And what he's trying to convey is, remind Crito is, look, who do we, if we want to get fit, who do we listen to? We listen to a trainer. We don't listen to someone on the street. If we want to learn music or whatever it is, we consult someone who knows what they're talking about. We just don't listen to everybody online, for example. So we always want to listen to people who know what they're talking about. And then he moves on to, I guess, a little more theoretical ideas around justice, the body. So in the next section,
but that about the body and justice and all that are important, I think, because he's showing its link to health, so just as if you were to eat randomly or whatever, or not get the right exercise, what does he say? It would end up harming your body. He says something about that. And likewise, he says, I'm just sort of trying to remember what it said, but basically, in the case of the body, you're going to damage the body, and that would make life hard to live. But when it comes to justice and the just and the unjust, the good and evil and stuff like that, then surely these are even more important than the body. And for you to trust the wrong kind of persons when it comes down to those sort of topics, and to get it wrong would have an even more kind of damaging effect on you than even the case in which disease had wrecked the body, because obviously these things are much more important and should be given the more kind of emphasis, I guess, than even concerns about the body. So there's a kind of normative health in the background, is what I'm sort of saying. It's not just doing the right thing, it's doing the right thing because it's normatively healthy to do so. It's appropriate.
But when he talks,
sorry, go on, Lorraine.
Yeah, when he talks about health, though, it seems to me that he's talking about shame. That Socrates is sort of wanting to do the good to avoid shame. or at least that's how I read it anyway, which I thought was an interesting way of looking at it, that I'm not sure it's necessarily a positive that he wants the good, as opposed to he wants to avoid shame, which is kind of what Crito is wanting to avoid. He wants to avoid the shame that could be brought upon him if he doesn't try to help his friend escape and live. And it seems to me that then Socrates goes, but I don't want to escape and live because that would bring shame on me.
Yeah, it's a different kind of disgrace, isn't it?
That's right. But it's shame at the bottom of both of them. I think.
Yeah.
But
Yeah,
anyway.
definitely. Yeah, you're right. Because, yeah, and it's the difference between the common opinion and the opinion of the wise, according to Socrates, is that it would be a shame to be the one who harms the laws and violates justice. That would bring great shame to a person.
Right. Yeah, and so he'd rather die than have shame, than live with shame.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
So
I
I think
guess we often translate that in the Stoic stuff as it's better to die than to not act virtuously, or if you're put in a position where you can't do the right thing, they say that the Stoics always have an open door policy, that there's always a way out of this uncompromising situation, which is better than violating these sort of fundamental principles, the right use of reason, for example.
But it seems interesting to me that he says that because he's 70 and not much life to live, he can make this grand gesture, almost as though, well, I don't have much left, so it's not such a big gesture. And it made me think, well, if he was 17, would he have made the same gesture? Because that would have been a greater sacrifice he was making.
Yeah.
It's just interesting.
But
he mentions his age of being 70.
Yeah.
So on.
But I think, you know, and again, this comes back to something we did talk about last time, which was to do with how, you know, it's with experience that we learn to interrogate our impressions and to arrive at better judgments and so on. It's an iterative process over time. So Socrates has only reached his current level of reasoning, I guess, partly because he's an elder person now. You know, at 17 he wouldn't have had that perspective or that good judgment. So I think it is relevant that he is old, because it's through that and through his experience and his demonstrated courage and his virtuous life that he's in a position to make that judgment. So yeah, I think it is relevant, but I just don't think it would have been the same equation if he'd been a young person.
Yeah, I agree, Lorraine. It makes sense because he does say that, doesn't he? He says, you know, I've had 70 years to work out whether or not I like the laws or not, and the laws take that view and say, you've been the most constant one in the city. You've been here. You've obviously been happy with things. So he's sort of saying, but I agree with you. A young person might not know. A young person might not have made up their mind. And then it would be a bit more of a complex argument, wouldn't it? Because it'd be like, well, did I make the contract or didn't I? I'm still making up my mind. But Socrates clearly is saying, well, we all know I've made up my mind, you know.
Yeah.
So then he sets it out and says, we must examine whether it is just that I try to get out of this or not just. And if it seems just, let us try. If not, leave it alone. But the considerations which you speak of about spending money and public opinion and bringing up children, perhaps these may really be, Crito, speculations of people, I mean the many, who lightly put to death and would as lightly bring to life again if they were able, or with no good reason. But for us, since the argument gives us no choice, it may be that we have nothing to examine except only what we said just now. Shall we be doing right in paying money to any who will get me out of this, and in thanking them too, and in getting out or being got out ourselves? Or in truth, shall we be doing wrong in all this? And if it proves that we shall be acting wrongly, it may be that we ought not to consider whether we ought to stay here quietly and die or suffer anything and everything else, but only the question of doing wrong. And Crito doesn't have any idea. He says, I think you argue well, Socrates. What are we to do then?
But that bit's really interesting, isn't it?
Yeah.
The way I
exactly.
read it is that I fear only the doctrines of the multitude, who would be as ready to call people to life as if they were able, as they are to put them to death. That made me think, because he's talking about justice throughout this passage too, but the meaning of justice here seems to suggest that it has to do with a knowing what is in one's power and what is not, and that justice has some bearing there. And the problem with the common opinion is that people don't seem to know what is rightly within their power. So they, like he says, they would call people to life if they could, So that's an interesting point. There's a kind of acceptance about what is right and what is wrong, what is within your power, what is not within your power.
I think this is probably one of those passages that some historians point to as being Plato's, or one of Plato's critiques of the radical Athenian democracy, that it could decide one minute to execute somebody, and then 2 days later might have a different idea, but of course by then it's too late. There were occasions, and I can't think of the exact occasion, but I read about it not that long ago, where the Athenian assembly decided to send 2 ships to punish one of their colonies who'd done the wrong thing or disobeyed something, and then a day later they changed their minds and sent another ship to kind of countermand the order. So this is the kind of thing that can be pointed to, and maybe Plato is pointing to it here, is the kind of crazy, impulsive decision making which can occur in the radical democracy that was Athens at this time.
Yeah, that makes sense. And that would also say, because he has to come to saying something like, it's not the law's fault, the law is sound, it's the way people use the law which is problematic. Which I don't know if I agree with. I mean, but just before that bit too, sorry, there was a bit here that I thought was important because it reminded me of Euthydemus. He said, do you agree with that, the first principle about listening to the wiser man, not to the common opinion? And then he says, and do you agree with another opinion? He says, but still I find with surprise that the old argument is, as I conceive, unshakable as ever, and I shall like to know whether I may say the same of another proposition, so this second principle, that not life, but a good life is to be chiefly valued. It's not just about living, but it's about living well. Yes, that also remains. And Socrates says, and a good life is equivalent to a just and honorable one. That holds also. Yes, that holds. And then it went into that bit you were talking about, Judith. But I just thought it was nice that he brought it back to doing well. And remember, we talked about that kind of ambiguity of doing well. Well, here he's clearly pointing out that no, what we mean is the same as living justly.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so then they start again. Socrates says, don't go on singing the same old song that I must get out of this against the will of the Athenians. I would give a great deal to act with your approval and not against you. Look at the beginning of the investigation, see if you think it is good enough, and try to answer the question as you may think best. He can't help himself, can he, Socrates? He's just got to interrogate them. I will try, says poor old Crito. Okay, so Socrates harks back to all their previous principles. Are they old men conversing earnestly together no better than children? They have to remind themselves whether the many say so or not, and whether we may have to suffer things even harder than these or gentler than these. To do wrong is really both evil and ugly for the doer in every way. Do we say this or not? We do, Crito agrees. Then we must not do wrong at all. We must not. Not even when wronged, wrong in return, as the many think, since we must do no wrong at all. It seems so, says Crito, sounding not very convinced. Very well, must we injure Crito or not? We should not, I suppose, Socrates. Very well, to injure in turn when ill-treated, is that right, as the many say, or wrong? Certainly not right, for I suppose to do evil to people, surely said anyone in the world, however we may be treated by them. So that's Socrates' very strong statement that however he is treated, he is not good. And he underlines it. He reminds Crito to consider these principles carefully. And he repeats this idea: is it ever right to do injustice, or in return to defend oneself? And Crito actually doesn't have anything to argue against that. He says he thinks the same. So then Socrates brings in this idea of an agreement, which is kind of often pointed to as like an argument around what later became called contract theory. You know, the implicit contract that citizens of a polity are understood to enter into when they are old enough to understand what it is to belong to the state.
It seems to me, though, that he's holding himself to a much higher standard than he's holding the state, because the state could do unjust laws, or it could be a just law that's done unjustly, so they didn't apply it properly. And so then he suffers the fate of death at the hands of it. And so he goes, oh, well, even if they were wrong, this is my fate and I have to take it. So he holds himself where he can do no wrong, and yet the state can. He kind of admits that it could be an unjust law, or it could be an unjust application of a just law. So they can do wrong, the state, but he can't. And I find that quite interesting, that he makes his own standard and his own account and weighs that far above the state, and yet he's subjecting himself to the whims of the state. So
yeah, I think you're right, Lorraine. I think he's acknowledging that yes, the decision making can be arbitrary and impulsive, and the many, because essentially it was a democracy of the many. The many do make these sort of random decisions, because he's already identified very early on in the dialogue that, yep, that's what the many do. They decide one thing, they decide another. It's all over the place. So yes, I think you're absolutely right. I think he is holding himself to a different standard, but now he's kind of, the argument almost shifts in a way from being about justice and injustice. Then he's kind of shifted a bit to this personal relationship with the state, and he personifies the laws. He imagines them speaking to him.
But just before you get to that too, that's interesting, Lorraine, but it's because Socrates is always going on, and he mentions it here too, about it's better to suffer a harm or a wrong than to be the one who inflicts the wrong. And so it's okay for him to suffer the wrong of the legislator, but it's not okay for him then to turn against the laws and do a wrong against them in retaliation. And part of his thing is to say, well, I could have left if I didn't like the laws before, but clearly I've approved of the laws and lived by the laws and benefited as a result of there being these particular laws in this city. You know, my education, the fact that my mum and dad met each other. He gives a few of those sort of reasons, doesn't he?
He does.
It's yeah, It's a tricky one. I think I wonder if it makes more sense in this ancient context than it would today. Like, what if we lived in a society that was a bit, how do you do, and we didn't agree with the laws? What would we do? Would we say, oh, fair enough, chuck me in prison because, yeah, you know, I've benefited from this totalitarian system for quite a while? Or would we do something about it? Obviously, the context is quite different, I think.
It is, but it
Well, it
reminds
is and it isn't. Oh, sorry, go on, Ray.
Go on, Judith.
I was going to say, yeah, it is. I think it's for each of us to consider in our own situations and how we respond to the laws of our particular state. But I think there's I think it comes across as a fairly old-fashioned approach, right? Socrates' loyalty to his city and to its laws, even if he personally has fallen foul of them. But I think it's I think there's something to be said for it. I think, yeah, I mean, I think perhaps these days we've gone to the other extreme and take very little regard for tradition. You know, the fact that our Westminster system has come from hundreds of years of common law in the UK, and you know, if we stop and think about what's gone into the development of our legal systems, then we're probably inclined to have a bit more respect for them than if we don't do that. And we can have respect for the system while disagreeing with a particular interpretation, or as you said earlier, Lorraine, there could be a law that seems just in general, but in a particular application, it could be unjust. So there's all those sort of variations on the theme. But yeah, I think Socrates' loyalty to the state that he loves, I think there's more to it than we might necessarily than is more readily apparent to a modern readership, I guess.
Yeah, it's really murky. I mean, I was thinking when I was reading this about whistleblowers, for example, or like Julian Assange or whatever, those sort of examples. And yeah, and I don't know, like, yeah, it was just seems, maybe you're right, maybe the wise whistleblower would be the kind of guy who goes, well, you know, I did benefit and I did have a good career in media and my kids grew up with all these benefits and they can have my super after they execute me. Maybe. I don't know. It's a tough one.
Yeah, look, I found it interesting because I was thinking about the whole COVID debacle that we had, and thinking of following the laws of the state and what decisions I made at that time and how that would fit with this dialogue. Yes, and so I couldn't get that leap of I'm going to be a good citizen to the state because it's been good to me in some form or other, as though the state existed in and of itself. Because I'm not certain that I actually think the state does exist in and of itself, or as though it's a constant, it's ever changing. It is the will of the many, allegedly, though perhaps not. Maybe it's the will of a few, disguised as the will of the many. And it's constantly evolving and changing, and only responds to the objections of a few. And so his willingness to lay down and die and go, okay, that is my fate because I've lived by it, and even if it's unjust, I don't want to do an unjust act. So I'm going to go along with it. I found that, whilst I can see where he's coming from, I thought actually that's not a decision I would have made. and haven't made in these scenarios. And you could even think about it, if it was a fascist state, would you follow the fascist state? Would that be the good, wise thing to do? And say, well, they're going to imprison me and kill me, so I'm just going to let them, which is kind of a bit like the Julian Assange thing that you've just mentioned. So I'm not sure how it sits within a modern way of being and how we view the state. Because he seems quite a good thing, whereas I'm not certain that the state is such a good thing. I think it can be, and there are good things amongst it, but it doesn't make it a good thing in totality.
That's why I kind of read it more as about something beyond, I don't know, like just that kind of idea of punitive law. He's obviously getting at the thing that makes it a civilization, right? Because he's talking about, I mean, on the next page, I don't want to jump ahead too much, but basically he says the laws have this voice. They're talking back to him in a sort of dialectical style, and they say, for after having brought you into the world and nurtured and educated you and given you and every other citizen a share in every good that we had to give, we further proclaim and give the right to every Athenian that if he does not like us when he has come to age and has seen the ways of the city and made our acquaintance, he may go where he pleases and take his goods with him, and none of us laws will forbid him or interfere with him. So there's this kind of, yeah, I think we already said that there's this kind of, you know, here, try this out. If you like this and you're benefiting from it, then you're kind of signing a certain kind of contract that you approve of this way of being. But more than that too, I was thinking there's a sense of, maybe it's not there, maybe I'm imagining it, but it seems to me there's a sense that because you've been raised in these systems of education and this notion of family and this notion of culture and this notion of companionship that is all part of the Athenian what do you call it, like package that he's talking about as laws, I guess it's all part of it. He's embedded in it. He is exactly because he is a wise man. He is a wise man because of the goodness of the Athenian culture that has allowed him to become that thing. So for him to turn his back on what he proclaims as the good, you know, wisdom and the like and justice, is to harm the thing that allowed him to benefit in the way that he benefits, i.e. to become wise. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And obviously that would be an untenable.
I think that's absolutely right. And I think you've pinpointed that, Courtney, because he makes the analogy or the metaphor a couple of times. You know, he reminds the laws remind him about his parents, but the laws say, are you so wise that you fail to see that something else is more precious than your father and mother and all your ancestors besides your country? So it's an appeal to those relationships, those absolutely central relationships, in which of course every person is embedded. They're all, you know, they all have a father and a mother, and they all have a relationship with the culture that they're in. And again, this is, you know, in a much more individualistic age, that's harder for us to grasp. You know, ever since perhaps Nietzsche, I suppose. But that's what that's how Socrates sees it. It's an embedding. You're right. It's a matrix in the original meaning as a womb. You know, it's that close of a bond, I guess. And it's hard for us to kind of access that without, you know, thinking about it quite carefully.
And to overthrow those laws would mean that he couldn't have been wise, you know, or other people like him coming along wouldn't be able to become nearly as wise as they would like to, because that particular necessary framework wouldn't be there because people like him had undone it or whatever. And that's interesting because remember, other Hellenistic schools had this idea that you were naturally wise, like the Epicureans, you know, that you were born wise by nature. But here you've got this, no, there has to be the right laws, the right framework, the right culture, the right pedagogy, that it's educational, it has an intellectual component, not just what nature has given you.
Mhm.
And so I think this passage also, Socrates reminds Crito, you must not give way or retreat or leave your post, but in war and in court and everywhere, you must do whatever city and country commands, or else convince her where the right lies. Now, he had his turn at trying to convince the city where the right lay. That was in his apology. He wasn't able to convince the city then. They took a different view. So he had his go. He had his chance at trying to persuade the judges, but he failed there.
Mm.
So, and that also, this military imagery reminds us that Socrates was prepared to give his life earlier for his city, you know, at the siege of Potidæa and subsequent campaigns. His courage was legendary. He fought right in the front lines for Athens. So that relationship is a very close one, and he's likening it absolutely to a parental relationship.
And that relationship, I think, really plays out with the stylistic choice of having the laws have a voice, you know, the dialectical nature, because when you do it that way between Socrates and the laws as a kind of speaker, it creates a relationship. And you can see like that that there is a real relationship and it's embedded and but we often don't think in terms of that, do we? We think of the laws as this kind of I don't know, just like a dead thing, an inert thing, a sterile thing.
And I think this personification of the laws and it's the feminine gender, you know, she bids you, she this, that must refer back to his dream, right? The handsome woman, well grown and dressed in white.
Yeah.
And that's what I was just reminded, Courtney, again of Lady Philosophy in in Boethius. You know, that's again the conversation with an embodied an abstraction, but embodied as a woman.
I think it's interesting though, on my bit, I've got, it goes on to say, at the time you prided yourself on not being angry if you had to die, and you chose death, you said, in preference to exile. So I find it interesting that from what I've read there, that he has a choice between death or exile, and he chooses death. Now, to me, that choice is a personal choice, such as he thinks, oh, well, that's what the good, wise person would do. But that's where I question his motivation, because I think, is it what a good, wise person would do? Or is it what someone who wants to avoid shame would do? Because he can't live with himself and the shame if he were to be in exile. As though it's honourable that he chose death. I find that interesting, that he has the choice between the two and chooses one, and then tries to convince us that that's the good, wise thing to do.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. It's like he's got
Both of them are the law.
yeah, so it seems he's got an ulterior motivation.
Yeah.
Because I think his argument in the apology was something like, I will choose the lesser of two evils, right? And it would be wrong to admit that I've done the wrong thing if I haven't, if I don't believe that I have. Isn't that what he does? And however, I don't believe that dying or death is an evil because we all must die, etc., etc. Isn't that how the story goes, Judith? So he decides to choose death as a lesser evil because it's not particularly an evil. But yeah. Now I can see what you mean, because that's all good and fair and fits with his philosophical style. But on the other hand, he obviously, more than anything, doesn't want to put himself in the shameful situation of abusing virtue, whatever he conceives that to be.
Yeah.
I think it's, well, what do you mean by shame, Lorraine? I mean, there's different ways of understanding the concept of shame, right? And what Crito, the way that Crito understands it, you know, what everyone would say about me, I would be so ashamed if they thought I was mean or unhelpful or whatever. That's one thing, but I don't think that's what's motivating Socrates. It's not that kind of shame. It's the knowledge. Well, it's a kind of knowledge, right? It's a knowledge of not having done the best thing. That's what shame would be to Socrates. It's not nothing about public opinion.
No, but it would still be a shame.
Still shame.
He would condemn
Well, is it though?
himself.
I mean, is it the same understanding of it?
Well, am I reading he doesn't want to condemn himself to shame by choosing exile. He goes, that's not a life worth living. I mean, he doesn't say that, but that's what I'm reading. That's not a life worth living if I had to live with shame. And so I'd rather not live with shame, is the way I read it.
It's probably we'd have to go back to the Greek, which I haven't got up at the moment. But maybe we can explore that in another session. Is the issue of shame and
we do.
Aidos. That's what the Greek is.
I think it's plausible because you see stuff like that in the Stoics. Not saying it's exactly the same, but like, for example, I've just got the discourses here, right? Here from 1.4, he said 1.3, he says, this is Epictetus, so sorry, it's not Socrates, but he says, it is because of this kinship with the flesh that some of us who are inclined towards it become like wolves, perfidious, treacherous, noxious creatures. We all know this line, animals. For what else is a slanderous and ill-natured person than a fox, or something even more unfortunate and base? Watch out then and take care that you don't end up as one of these wretched creatures. Yeah, look, it could be the case that it's just a bad for you. But it's also a great shame to lose that part of yourself and reduce it to something much more vile. I mean, I could go along with that. It's a shame to have harmed yourself so horribly by ignoring your use of reason, you know, by not using reason correctly when otherwise you could have in the situation. I mean, I think it's an interesting topic. So, you know, yeah, I can see what you're saying, Lorraine. Possibly. And I think I mean, maybe this way coming from Lorraine, like I'm guessing this is kind of what the existentialists would do, right? They would kind of go after some of Socrates' claims, like Nietzsche does, by saying his use of morality is a kind of perversion, and you know, maybe he's really just afraid of shame, you know, those kinds of things. So I think it's fair that you voice them, because maybe we will come to them if we do read the existentialists, for sure.
Yeah, I think we've got to be clear though that what we're talking about when we say shame is actually what the Greeks were talking about, which is not necessarily guaranteed. I mean, there's a huge literature on shame in Greek literature, but whether it's exactly, but what is, if it's, is that the same as we might be considering here? I don't know.
But I mean, Lorraine might be saying, I'm guessing that people have psychological motivations and they haven't really changed much over the last few thousand years. So it's quite possible that one of Socrates' motivation is to protect himself from shame, not the kind of shame that comes from what other people think, but in this case, the shame of not following through with his commitments.
Yeah.
It's plausible.
Yeah, we should have another session on that. All right, so, but Crito agrees. And then Socrates goes on to quote the laws again. And this is interesting. But you did not prefer Lacedaemon, that's Sparta, or Crete, which you always declare to be under good laws, nor any other city, Hellenic or barbarian, but you are less out of town than the lame or the blind or others who are maimed. So much more remarkably than the other Athenians, you like the city and us, the laws, that is clear. For what city could please without laws? Do you remember we did the Phaedrus some years ago, and the start of the Phaedrus is always so striking to me because it's one of the very few occasions where Socrates actually goes outside the city walls. He says, I don't often do this, you know. He is so much part of the streets of Athens that he is almost never outside it, except when he was on campaign. That's how much he identified with the city. Okay, so this is another argument that Socrates puts in the mouths of the laws, and it's an argument against fleeing to another city, such as Thebes or Megara, because other cities don't look very kindly on people who flee from their own cities' justice system, funnily enough, because that renders them possibly suspect. They will think you a destroyer of laws and look askance at you, and you will confirm the judges in their opinions so that they will believe they decided aright in their judgment. For whoever is a destroyer of laws would surely be thought to be a corrupter of young men and foolish people. So that was the charge against Socrates, and the laws are saying to him, look, if you don't obey us, then you're going to be confirming that otherwise controversial charge.
Mm-hmm.
And he would lose all his credibility, right? Don't you think that the whole business with Socrates will be a notorious, nasty story? You must think so. And suppose you decamp from these places and go to the friends of Crito in Thessaly. And as you mentioned, Courtney, earlier, the greatest disorder and laxity is found there. And so, yeah, I think this is actually a sketch. It underlines Plato's skill as a storyteller, that he's putting out a counterfactual, right? He's having Socrates imagine the laws, imagining what it would be like to be an exile, you know, to be a runaway, essentially, to be someone outside the laws. He's sketching this really rather convincing picture of someone who has no home anymore, who has no credibility, who has no and who's just, you know, people were going to give him sidelong looks. And is that the famous Socrates who just ran away from a bad situation? So,
but
yeah,
again,
I think
I'm going to jump on Lorraine's thing there. It smacks of shame, doesn't it?
It does.
Or something like that. You know, like you won't be able to talk about virtue. That's the thing that you live for. I mean, because no one will take you seriously anymore.
And so there he's valuing the voice of the many. So why
that's
would
true.
it matter whether they
Yes,
listen
that's
to
true.
him or not? If he was wise and virtuous, it wouldn't matter. He should listen to just the one, which is what he argues earlier on.
But then again, see,
Very
he
true.
would have proved that he wasn't wise because he turned his back on the laws, which somehow...
But the law gave him the option of death or exile. So he didn't turn his back on the law. He just chose death over exile, which is what I find interesting. Which is how I read it. I don't know if that's right, but that's how I read it.
Yeah.
It reminded me a little bit of Michael Foucault, with the self-policing subject, whereby we imagine what would happen in this other city and what we imagine what other people would think about us. And so we police ourselves just on the imagination of that and go, oh, well, that would be so terrible. I can't possibly live with that. I choose death. Which I find an interesting thing to do, because it seems to me that he's doing some kind of mental somersaults but he dresses it up as though he's arguing about the state and the law and the good and the just. And I think they're in there, but I also think there are mental somersaults he's doing.
Yeah, I can see where you're coming
Yeah.
from. Yeah, Lorraine, because
That's true. But in a sense, and this, you know, will feed through into the Stoic tradition stuff. The ultimate, the ultimate guarantee of whether you're serious about your principles or not is imprisonment, and ultimately in a state with capital punishment, it's capital punishment. You know, it's not, you know, you can put everything else to one side, but the ultimate endorsement, or the ultimate verification, if you like, of a person's principles is whether they're prepared to undergo torture, exile, torture, and execution. And this came up again and again as a test of philosophers in both Greece and Rome. So it wasn't just a kind of a it wasn't just a thought experiment. It was a real test.
For sure. I think Lorraine's kind of getting at this idea that the way the drama plays out, where he's imagining what would happen if he stayed and what would happen if he left, is a kind of example of Foucault's interiority. And this, you know, Nietzsche and those sort of characters are really focused on how the morality of Socrates is a turning away from the world into this interiority and kind of carving out this inner world within the self in which there's good and evil and stuff like that, and that it's a suppression in some sense of one's will to life or true instinct.
Yeah.
It's the kind of thing they explore.
Nietzsche echoed Callicles, right, in the Gorgias. You know, that was so.
But I guess the point here
Yeah, I
that
mean,
Foucault is pointing out is there's psychological evidence of it. He would take it. Look at him doing this and look at him doing that. Look at him going back and forward, doing all this stuff in order to try and get away from what he's really worried about, which is being exposed and feeling like a fraud and feeling full of shame because he hasn't been able to live up to his principles. So he has to die.
Yeah.
You know, that's the kind of thing that the kind of
Yeah,
existentialist critique would do, I guess.
Yeah, so it's inauthentic. Is that the critique?
Yeah, well, and that we've inherited it as well in our modern kind of traditions, in how we've swallowed or how we've followed that kind of moral path that gets that interiority that gets expanded in Christianity, for example.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know. I just think it's interesting too, because they get into that. But sorry, we've gotten away from Plato.
Yes. So then Cecily turns out to be a bit of a joke. You know, eating and drinking in Cecily, as if you travelled abroad to dine in Cecily. Will you take the children to Thessaly and bring them up and educate them there and make them foreigners that they may enjoy that too? So yes, it all gets a bit rhetorical, doesn't it?
Do you know one bit that really galled me though? I mean, there's things I like about this argument, but you know, there must be more to it than just the surface level arguments, I'm thinking, because there's that bit in here where he says, sorry to go back a page, he says, nor can you think that you have a right to do to us what we have done to you. Would you have any right to strike or revile or do any other evil to a father or to your master, if you had one, when you have been struck or reviled by him or received some other evil at his hands? I was thinking, hell yeah, of course you would. You know, if your dad is treating you poorly, and why shouldn't you be able to, you know, overthrow his domination? But here it's kind of taken as, well, no, of course not.
That's right.
It's as if you belong to your father in the same way as
Well, that certainly did. I mean, that was how it was.
Yeah. So when we look at it now, is what I mean is the context has shifted slightly. So yeah, it's kind of hard to swallow some of the sentiments.
Well, yeah. I mean, I don't think we have the kind of you know, patriotism or
No. But if that
yeah.
analogy stood, you know, the state is like a father, just like you would put up with any mistreatment that your father gave you, you should put up with the mistreatment that the state gives you. Well, that would break down pretty quickly in the modern context, because we obviously think of very poor fathers and think, you know, there's a lot of commentary about how you shouldn't put up with that sort of stuff from bad fathers.
Yeah, so maybe that's kind of key to understanding the dialogue, really.
Mm. But obviously
so there's also a sorry.
I just wanted to say that I think it's easy to get hung up on those little details, and obviously that shouldn't undo his argument. I think there's more to the point, obviously, and I think the bigger picture is that that we do benefit from the societies that we're brought up in, and they're infinitely better than lawless kind of cultures. And maybe that's hard to relate to for us, but if you did live in some ancient time where you had warring tribes just over there that you know were vastly, I don't know what's the word, inferior in terms of technology and healthcare and things like that, then of course you ought to look at it a little bit more like, well, this is really pretty good and has allowed me to have the access to these technologies that have allowed me to become a famous philosopher for a start, and for my children and friends to benefit.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, we often lack gratitude for what our societies have afforded us. I mean, I think, again, it comes back to a great deal about our individualistic culture, is we've forgotten the incredible advances in technology, medicine, you know, infrastructure, all those things that we're very tempted to take for granted and not be grateful for. But we probably should. Well, we definitely should be grateful for them. You know, we should be grateful for the fact that we can communicate like this online over, you know, long distances, and that the lights are on. How long that'll be the case, who knows? But you know, stuff like that, all the things that we take for granted. And I think that's, you know, that's a big picture takeaway from this dialogue, is how grateful are we for what the state does afford us? You know, whether imperfectly, whether in some cases, yeah, not in the way we would ultimately choose, but we're all afforded a great many privileges by the states in which we live. And if we take issue with one or another aspect of the laws, sure, fine, whatever. But the big picture is that we're all incredibly privileged to live in the states that we do live in. And when we do take issue with what's imposed upon us in terms of the laws, then maybe that's a more complex matter than we would often, you know, our knee-jerk reaction is often, oh, that's crap or whatever, you know, there's stupid people have done this or whatever, and this doesn't work and this should be better. And maybe we always need to take a step back from that and appreciate what we do have, I guess, is part of what I take away from Socrates' musings here.
But that's true, but there's also another layer to that, isn't there? Because Socrates isn't particularly concerned with what the many and the multitude think, meaning there's something about the kind of thing that he was exposed to. Again, I keep going over the same thing. The kind of thing that he was exposed to in Athenian culture that allowed him to become a rare individual. So it's not that he cares about the lights being on necessarily, or not that there were, but you know what I mean, or those little things that the many would call privileges. He's concerned with the things that actually, well, you know, the things like the laws and the institutions and stuff like that, those finer products of culture.
Well, I think they're all interrelated. You know,
Yes,
they're a bit different, but they're also a bit the same. You know, again, all aspects of human life are bound up in culture, whether it's the laws or whether it's the engineering that holds the bridges together. I mean, it's all aspects of human culture. It's yeah. I mean,
well,
so,
I mention it like that
yes,
because
obviously.
Think about, you know, some of the criticisms that people make of our own culture, where they maybe are making it harder to get a liberal arts education or something like that. You know what I mean? Maybe that's not necessary, but my point is, obviously it was available to Socrates or something like that, you know, the philosophical schools, for example. I mean, maybe I'm just picking on something that's not exactly in his mind, but I don't know. Maybe that's the kind of thing he's gesturing towards too. The kind of culture that allows for philosophical discourse in the streets. I don't know. You know what I mean?
Yeah, for sure.
I mean, I think we could do with a bit more of that rather than worrying about what's on TV tomorrow night, for example.
But what's interesting is after he's imagined the laws speaking to him, and this is in the final paragraph, he imagines them saying, "For if you do what you intend, things clearly do not seem any better for you in this world, and you will find no more justice and piety here, nor will any of your people. And when you come to the next world, it will be no better. As things are, if you depart, you will depart wronged not by us, the laws, but by human beings." So that was interesting because that's the imagined person that representing the laws depersonalizing themselves and saying, well, the responsibility is not the laws, it's actually the people implementing it.
Yeah,
it's the human beings that are at fault here, or that are imposing this outcome on you, not the laws themselves.
and it makes sense, right? The people are going to imperfectly misuse the laws. This reminds us a bit of the Stoics' use of the preconceptions, right? The laws are based on justice, and justice has a perfect form in the world of the forms, right? And for the Stoics, I guess, their idea is that there are preconceptions that underlie our innate ideas. Well, they are innate ideas about the good and justice and things like that. It's just that our articulation of them is far from perfect. So the laws themselves are fairly, they what's the word? They take their power from the form of justice, which is eternal and beautiful and perfect. I'm assuming he's drawing on his theory of forms, and it's people that don't get that right, because they're, especially these people, the many, because why would you be surprised should be the underlined passage, because they're not discerning. They're listening to the voice of the many. They're not listening to the voice of the one. So I have to make an example and show how the one who listens to the voice of the one dies when facing injustice, showing that, like it says in the back of, well, in the apology, right? And Anitus might kill me, but they can never harm me.
Harm me, that's right. Another thing that just occurred to me is kind of in the background too, in this discussion of the laws, is part of Athenian mythology was around how they developed laws from a previously lawless kind of existence. So the whole story of Orestes, who killed his mother Clytemnestra and was pursued by the Furies, and the reason he killed his mother was that his mother had killed his father, and so there was this whole payback thing going on. And in the great Athenian tragic playwrights, they explored this whole issue of how, well, just a payback culture was reformed and turned into a legal system. And because it's better to have laws, no matter, whether they're being exercised perfectly or not, it's better to have them than to have just people doing private payback back and forth. So that's also in the background. The Athenians are incredibly proud of their development of their legal system. And again, that's another thing we take for granted. We take for granted that there is a legal system. Well, actually, no, there wasn't prior to a legal system. There was something else, and what there was payback and private feuding. And so, yeah, no matter how imperfect and non-optimal the laws may be, and their implementation, it's better than the alternative. That's always there as well, and that's, I guess, what he's gesturing to in Thessaly. It's disordered. There isn't a wonderful legal system like Athens.
Yeah. You're getting close to the end of it there now. Where are we up to?
Nearly at the end, yeah.
Did you read, which bit did you just read?
Well, just towards the end of that last
yeah.
paragraph.
You're a
Yeah.
victim, not of the laws, but of men. Yeah. But if you go forth returning evil for evil and injury for injury, breaking the covenants and agreements which you have made with us, and wrongdoing those whom you ought least to wrong, that is to say, yourself, your friends, your country, and us, we shall be angry with you while you live, and our brethren, the lords in the world below, will receive you as an enemy. I think you said that. And then I like this bit. Is he talking about the daemon? This is the voice. I know it's the voice of the laws, but it's just, this is the voice which I seem to hear murmuring in my ears, like the sound of the flute in the ears of the mystic. That voice, I say, is humming in my ears and prevents me from hearing any other. And I know that anything more which you may say will be in vain. Yet speak if you have anything to say. I have nothing to say, Socrates. Socrates says, and I know this ending is a bit different from your one. It says, then let me follow the intimations of the will of God. What is your one's slightly different, isn't it?
It says, let it be then, Crito, and let us act in this way, since this is the way that God is leading us. So that's, yeah, that's interesting.
I'm always intrigued
Because
by...
then that's kind of, sorry, go on.
No, I'll go after you, say.
Oh, I said, well, the God is leading us. Does he mean that the voice of the laws was as if it was the voice of a God? I guess it was. Is that his daimon?
Well, that's what I was wondering, because whenever he talks about that inner voice that he hears murmuring and stuff like that, it's usually a reference to the daimon, right? So I don't know whether he's saying that the daimon takes on these imaginary characters, like the laws, for example, that he interlocutes with. But elsewhere he says the daimon only ever says no to him, it doesn't
That's right, yeah.
engage in discussion.
Well, I guess the daimon's saying, don't run away. The daimon is saying, no, don't do that.
Yeah. Just like when he met Alcibiades, remember, I think the daimon told him not to approach him because he was too sexy.
Because he's bad news.
There you go. That was cool. Poor old Socrates is dead now. Did anyone shed a tear?
Yeah, I always do. If we did the Phaedo again, I'm sure I'd be in tears at the end.
Yeah.
I always know what happens, but it always gets me.
Yeah. No, it's very interesting. What do you think, Lorraine?
So what should we do next time? What do we do? What do we do next?
What do we do next?
I enjoyed this anyway. It was very good.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
Yeah, wonderful. Maybe Lorraine can bring us a short
No.
existentialist to read. No?
Oh, not yet.
Not yet.
Maybe a bit later.
Yeah. Do you have any hot ideas, Judith?
I'm trying to think about we came up with a list a while ago and now I've forgotten what was on it.
Well, we never...
Didn't you want to do some more Descartes, or did we do that?
We did Descartes. I wanted to do, at some point, Voltaire, because we've never done that.
Oh, yeah, well, why don't we do Candide?
Or Proust, any of those sort of ones. Yeah, Candide.
Well, let's do Candide next, because I've got a copy right here and it's nice and short.
Oh, is it? Brilliant. Sold. I'd love to read it. Sounds awesome.
Yeah.
I'm happy to lead that one.
Down the track too, I've got a copy of The Sorrows of Young Werther. I know we talked about it at some point, but I've never read it. I started reading it and I got sidetracked. Would you read that? That's Goethe, I think. Yeah. Well, there you go. That gives us a rough trajectory.
Yeah. I'll write it down. So we're doing Candide next, and then we're going to do Werther.
Yeah.
And then I'm sure we'll all get frustrated and want to read The Republic or Lysis or something. Lysis. Well, that was really wonderful. I really enjoy the conversation. I find it edifying. So thanks very much. And it's really nice to have your input, Lorraine, because sometimes Judith and I are a bit of an echo chamber. So it's nice to have, like when you're talking, I can actually go, oh, I think I've come across this sort of thinking before. This sounds like this is an existentialist perspective. So that's kind of cool. Yeah. All right. Well, have a good weekend, guys. We'll wrap it up.
Yep. Thanks, Courtney. Thanks, Lorraine.
See you soon. Bye bye.
Bye.